RC shocks. Here I have a RC8.2e electric off-road buggy shock. The racing season's done now and this thing's pretty beat. I have no idea what to expect when I take this apart. There's probably going to be some blown out seals and whatnot, so I'm just going to walk you guys through the proper process of how to rebuild these shocks so they don't leak. Some basic things you're going to need is Teflon tape, shock O-ring grease, shock tools. Basically this is what I have to use to open up these Team Associated shocks. It's like a mandatory tool. Pliers like this will do the trick, and then you just grab the top of the cap here and you can just twist. But the problem with these Team Associated shocks is they're such high quality, it's actually really difficult to crack this open just with pliers on the top and holding the bottom. And you don't want to wreck the shock body or the threads on the shock body with another set of pliers down here. While you're doing your rebuild, in case you run into any problems and you find worn out components, you're going to want some extra parts. So I got extra shock caps, I got shock body, O-ring seals, the lower spring mount, the lower threaded cap on the shock, shock bladder, shock bushings, shock boot, shock shafts, because it might be hard to tell that these are bent until you remove them and roll them across the table and they start flopping. And if you decide you want to change the dampening of your shocks, now's a good time. Basically, the more holes you have, the quicker the travel is going to be in the shock, the easier it's going to move, and the less holes, it's going to dampen a lot more. So if you drop it from 30 feet up, it's going to just like totally absorb all that and not bottom out. As well, make sure to get a container that you can put your used shock oil in. Okay, first things first, let's lay down some paper towel because it's about to get real slimy. First thing we're going to go ahead and do is just assess the shock itself. So we're going to go ahead and inspect the bushings. So there's one bushing in the lower shock rod here. Basically, if you can tap this and it falls right out, it's worn out. You need to replace it. As well as this upper shock bushing, if you can tap these two and they come out, I would recommend replacing them as well. We can go ahead and start disassembling. So basically the first thing you're going to need to do, pull the spring back like this, okay? And then you need to pull everything kind of back away from this lower shock retainer, and then you just pull the shock retainer out and slide it past the shaft like so. Okay, that's what that slot there is for, is so it can slide past the shaft. And now that that spring retainer is off, the spring can be removed. Next step would be to remove the shock cap. You can see that there is oil residue kind of building up around the lower part of the shock here. Definitely going to need to seal the threads on that cap and put the O-ring grease on the O-ring seals. I'll probably just replace the O-ring seals. So as I was saying, put the lower shock tool on the shock body and then the cap tool on and just give it a twist. And now this is going to open up. So as soon as this opens up, shock oil is going to want to come out. So I'll go ahead and grab my container and simply loosen the shock cap off. And there we go. And then typically what I'll do is I'll just let that sit in the container upside down for a little bit along with the shock cap, just so the fluid can drain out. Now that we got that opened up, we can access the internals. And I'll just grab the very bottom of the shock shaft, and then I'll just grab that and I'll just twist. And you really have to grab it really hard, because if you don't, it will slip, and you do not want to scratch the shock shaft. That's why I do it at the lowest point, because it's the least likely to go through the O-rings. So now that the lower shock shaft's off, make sure you keep track of what parts came off where. So in this case, this plastic shield retainer goes in the lower part of the boot, and the rod goes on the very bottom. And then what we can do now is we can slide the shock shaft all the way through to the other side and pull it out. So now that we have the shock shaft out, the next thing that we can do is we can loosen off this lower shock cap. Inside the shock body here, we'll have two O-rings. So I just use a small dentist pick like this and just very carefully just kind of work in behind the O-ring there and pull it out. Black washer retainer thing. It looks like there is a small O-ring seated right here. If at any point you find you're lost or you don't know how something went back together, the exploded diagram or instruction manual for your RC model can easily be found online. So if you're not sure, just reference the manual, because otherwise it's not going to go together properly. The very last thing that we skipped past was the shock bladder. Just inside the top of the shock cap here, you can find a rubber piece. If it's worn or damaged, you're going to want to replace it. Alright, so now for the exciting part. We get to start rebuilding the shocks. Right here, there is a little nub right here on this lower shock tool. Take your shock O-rings, slide them on here, then slide the plastic retainer on, and then your other O-ring. And then you can just simply pop that on in the shock body. But before we do that, shock O-ring grease. And then just work that in. So then we're just going to go ahead and put the O-ring seals into the shock body. So there we go. Got the new O-ring seals in there. Next up, what we're going to do is replace this seal that was leaking. I'm going to go ahead and just slide that on over top of this here. My little trick that I found online on some forums when I was doing some research was Teflon tape is actually really useful when you're doing RC shocks. So what you do with the Teflon tape is you take it and put it around the threads on the lower part of the shock, as well as where the shock cap goes. Just going to make sure that O-ring seal is seated completely all the way down, just like that, and just going to thread on the lower shock cap until it's firmly seated against the O-ring, like so. I just took a set of pliers and put it on the shock cap and the shock body, and I just gave it a quick little, and then that's done. So now we have a nice good seal inside the lower part of the shock, which is probably the most important because your shock's always going to be sitting in this orientation and the fluid's always going to be trying to escape on the bottom. We're just going to take our shock shaft, take a little bit of shock oil, put it on the shaft there, slide the shaft back in through the O-rings. Now that that's done, we can go ahead and get our shock cap ready as well. So like I said, I'm gonna go ahead and replace the shock bladder with a new one. So the longer you inspect parts, that's why I always say to take a look at them, because you will find small things like this. These are dried right out. And grab my new shock bladder. My hands have tons of shock oil on them, so I'm just gonna lube up that seal a little bit, and then just gonna go ahead and seat the shock bladder inside the top of the shock cap. Just to make sure it's seated properly, it'd be a good idea to take a pick or a blade screwdriver and just gently push down along the edge of the shock bladder just to make sure it is 100% seated properly. The next step is going to be to install the shock shaft boot. The boot slides on and then the plastic spacer slides on. Now that we have all that stuff on the shaft, we are ready to go ahead and put the rod end back on. For this step, I like to add a small amount of Loctite to the threads on the end. Basically what I do is I just kind of work it in with my finger, and then by the time you're done, you should have just enough Loctite on there that the threads are just filled in. Okay, there we go. So the lower shock rod end is on now. We're going to go ahead and fill the shock up with shock fluid next. Our helping hands are holding the shock in place, keeping it upright. What we're going to do now is we're going to add our shock fluid. For this shock, I'm using a 35 weight shock oil, and I ran this all last summer and I found it worked super awesome. And basically you're going to fill it right until it's at the very wee top right there. Now it's just a waiting game. We have to wait for the air bubbles to come back up to the top here. So I'm going to get some to come up right now by pushing the piston in a little bit and turning it. And the air that's trapped underneath, there we go. See that big bubble that just came up? So we're just going to wait and let the bubbles rise onto this now, and then I'll talk to you guys after that. Okay, so that should be long enough now. All the air has risen out of the fluid that we have put in there. Basically now is a new step that I have just recently learned about. It's called Rebound. What it does is, say I were to leave the shock fully extended like this and then tighten the cap, what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that the shaft hydraulic lock essentially is kind of what it feels like, and it won't go back in at all. It's kind of just going to stop right away. If you, say, tighten the shock cap with the shaft all the way in, then your shock is going to be able to move that full distance. It's kind of like a compression limiter, I guess you could say. Okay, so in order to set the rebound, what we need to do, compress the shock all the way in as far as you can get it to go. Do it nice and slow because the shock fluid has to have time to go through the holes in the piston, and we only want the shock fluid to spill out after we put the cap on. There's holes in this cap here, and as we tighten the shock cap, the fluid's going to come out that hole. Just going to very gently start the threads while maintaining downward pressure on the shock. You can see right there, see the fluid just started coming out of that hole. Hand tighten it, keep going, and then just to make sure that bladder's seated properly, just loosen it a little bit and then tighten it again. Okay, that should be good now. Take our paper towel dowel as extra grip, and we're just gonna tighten the shock cap a little bit more. The real test here is going to be to make sure we could push this all the way in, and it should pop on a little bit. So if we had tightened the shock cap with it all the way extended like this, push the shock in about that far, and then it would just go straight back onto full extent. And then so for the shock bushing, it goes in on the narrow side, so the nut actually sits in this wide spot here. So the shock bushing is just gonna go ahead and press in right there. Thanks for watching, guys. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later.